Good evening. I would like to welcome everyone to this live international webcast with Helga Zepp-LaRouche. Today is Sunday, March 24th, and we have called this webcast on an emergency basis because of the nature of the current international strategic crisis. Mrs. Zepp-LaRouche, as most of you are aware, is a leading German stateswoman. She is the founder and chairwoman of Germany's Buzo Party and also of the International Schiller Institute. My name is Dennis Small. I am the Ibero-American editor of Executive Intelligence Review magazine founded by Lyndon LaRouche. We are gathered here today in what is, in fact, an extremely dramatic week. Yesterday was March 23rd, the 30th anniversary of President Ronald Reagan's historic speech for the SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, which had been intellectually authored by Lyndon LaRouche, and which was then and remains today of absolute strategic importance to address the crisis facing humanity on the planet as a whole. We also are gathered today in the midst of a gigantic crisis which has been brought to people's attention because of events in Cyprus. Clearly not a crisis caused by Cyprus, but a crisis which has been exploded into public view by events there. This is unresolved at this moment. The world is at the brink of complete financial disintegration, and we face the requirements of both solving that economic and financial crisis and the unfinished business posed by Mr. LaRouche's Strategic Defense Initiative in terms of getting rid of the danger of war and establishing an entirely new paradigm for humanity. So with that, I would like to introduce to you Mrs. Zepp-LaRouche. She will speak to us today with introductory remarks, and we will then have a period of questions and answers, which I will present to her. If there are questions in the course of this webcast that you would like to send in, you may do so by email. And should any questions not be answered in the course of this discussion, they will be forwarded to Mrs. LaRouche for her to answer subsequently in written form, time permitting. So without further ado, Mrs. LaRouche.
Yes, in this moment, which is indeed a grave moment for not only the people of Cyprus, but actually, for the entire European nations, because the crisis in Cyprus could really trigger a disintegration of the entire euro. And to say it in the beginning, there would be a possibility to solve this in an orderly way. But unfortunately, as of now, it does not look as if the European governments, and especially the Troika, are seeking that solution. However, we want to present it so that people can actually have a perspective of how to overcome this crisis. Now, as of now, you have dramatic events in Brussels. There is a meeting taking place, probably as we speak now, between the Cyprus president, the leaders of the Cyprus parties, and the Troika, the European government heads. And as of now, what is being supposedly discussed is the size of the savings, which is to be protected, the possible winding up of the second largest bank of Cyprus, the Laiki Bank, which could lose, the depositors could lose up to 20-25% or much more of that. That, however, will all be debated when the parliament comes together after the president and the party leaders return from Brussels on Monday or Tuesday. But, no matter what the result is, this is not going to be stopped there. I just want to give you a couple of voices of people who are concerned in the situation. For example, the Archbishop Christostomos basically said the euro cannot last. It's not a question if it will disintegrate tomorrow, but we are not talking about a long-term duration of the euro. Therefore, it's best if people think about how to escape. Now, the Turkish Minister for the European Union, Bagis, offered in the meantime to use the Turkish lira as a transition. The Financial Times, in an article yesterday, reported that even in the Troika itself, there was a big dispute how to proceed. And this is typical when systems come down, that even in those who are running the system, there is no unity anymore, typical of a doomed system. Now, supposedly there was a fight between the IMF and Berlin, the Berlin government on the one side, who, in order to avoid a disaster as it just had been experienced in Greece, just wanted to create a good and a bad bank and hit the large depositors and spare those which have guaranteed accounts. On the other side of this dispute was the European Commission, Jörg Asmussen from the European Central Bank and Thomas Wieser, the Austrian finance minister, who were all worried that a hit on the large depositors would panic the investors and cause a run on the banks that way. Now, at one point, there was absolutely no locked situation. In any case, the situation then was continued, and they supposedly decided on the bank robbery plan, but fights continue. Now, an ex-Cyprus central banker, Orphanides, basically said the EU has decided to disintegrate. The European project is crashing to the earth. I would have expected the EU Commission and the European Central Bank to support the European project to protect the citizens of the smallest and weakest member of the states against discrimination. They have a cavalier attitude towards the expropriation of property and bullying the people. This all has made a mockery of the EU treaties and has demonstrated that not all people are equal under the law. Now, the Daily Telegraph yesterday noted that if they impose capital controls, which is very likely, to avoid massive capital flight out of Cyprus, that this measure alone is going to put an end to the euro because it will make the Cypriot euros into a national currency, because then the ability to get euros out of Cyprus is essentially over. It makes the Cyprus euro worthless, and the euro ceases to be a single currency. Now, I think it is important to take a look on how this thing was triggered. It was triggered by the very strange decision of the EU, the Troika, and especially the German government to impose a haircut on the small depositors of the Cyprus banks up to 6.75%, and the large depositors over 100,000 euro 9.9%. Now, they thought this would go through. They were completely surprised when they realized on the 19th of March that the Parliament of Cyprus unanimously voted against that. And, in a certain sense, this is now what you could really call the worst possible accident of what could have happened. Because, first of all, remember that in October 2008, after the collapse of Lehman Brothers and AIG, Chancellor Merkel had promised that in the Eurozone, all deposits up to 100,000 euro would be guaranteed by the state. Now, remember, that was a period where a lot of people thought the whole system is coming down. There was a panic for a certain period where people were talking about the reintroduction of a new Bretton Woods system, and Merkel's promise was a big contribution to prevent a banking run, to calm the situation, and that promise now has been broken. Now, I don't quite understand why she did that, because somebody must have known that this is now going to lead to enormous repercussions. Already British politicians are advising that all the pensioners, hundreds of thousands British pensioners who are living in Southern Europe, should as quickly as possible get their money out of the Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, Greek banks, as long as they can do that. Now, if you don't have a run immediately in these countries, there will be a tendency that people will try to save their money and try to get it out. And, if they go for capital controls in all of these countries now, then that is the end of the euro. It could be that somebody decided to pull the plug and trigger this, to impose a banking union, to impose a political union, and to impose a dictatorship in Europe. But this cannot function either, because already now, the whole European project, which was promised to be peace in Europe, to guarantee that there would be no war ever again, which was a complete propaganda line, because when the euro was introduced, there was no war danger in Europe at all. But it was basically portrayed as if that would make Europe strong against competitors of emerging market countries, China, Brazil, the United States. But if you look at it today, there has been never such a disunity among the countries of Europe since 1945, like the one caused by these policies of the EZB, the Troika, and the European governments. There has been more hostility, more tension, more horrible memories coming up from the past. So the Euro project is a failed experiment, and whoever thinks he can impose now a European dictatorship, you cannot use armies against millions of people. So I don't think that this is a very likable proposition. Now, within the logic of the system, naturally one can say that Germany cannot continue to be the main country to bail out this failed project, because after all, the German taxpayer ability to do this is limited. There are presently only 4 surplus countries: Germany, Holland, Finland, and Austria, who have a trade surplus and a balance surplus. All the others are de facto in a negative position, and Cyprus is already the 5th country to require a bailout, and naturally this has reached the end of the rope. Now, even without this present situation, the transatlantic financial system is completely finished. You had hyperinflationary quantitative easing going on in the United States. Ben Bernanke had given his name Helicopter Ben the true meaning, namely that he decided to throw banking notes out of helicopters over whatever country and whatever bank was in need. So there is massive liquidity pumping going on in the United States. And when Mario Draghi a couple of months ago promised that he would do whatever it takes to save the euro, this meant that the EZB also was determined to print as much money, liquidity as possible, to buy up as many state bonds as possible. Now, so much for the famous last words, because obviously Draghi is not doing everything it takes to save the euro, because the case of Cyprus put an end to that. Now, this, however, is a big tragedy for the European people. Now, as I said, the euro is a failed experiment, and we are on the record that we said that before the euro was ever implemented. We said it when the idea of an imposed political European Monetary Union was proposed. It was clear that this could not function without a political union. And, well, at that time, this was the political price which Germany had to pay for the unification. And we should not forget that the euro came into being because Margaret Thatcher, François Mitterrand, and Bush Senior imposed it as the price for the German unification, that Germany should give up the D-Mark and that Germany should be contained in the corset of the Maastricht Treaty. And we at that point said it cannot function because the Eurozone was not a so-called optimal currency zone, because you had economies which were quite different. You had highly industrialized countries, you had agricultural countries, and especially you don't have one culture, you have many cultures. You have 17, or even in Europe you have 27 different cultures, nations, languages. So it was clear that this could not function. Now, Jacques Attali at the time, or a little bit later, had admitted in an interview that the euro was created deliberately with a birth defect, namely that it was clear it could not function, but a crisis would erupt, and then that crisis would be used to impose the political union, which was politically not accomplishable otherwise. Now, that is a danger, that some people may think to go in this direction, but I can see no circumstances how you can impose a dictatorship on a Europe which is divided as it is right now. Now, therefore, let's look at the solution. The problem is that the entire transatlantic financial system is bankrupt on top of the euro crisis. There is no way how you can remedy that by simply printing more money, because we are in a very close vicinity of the danger that what happened in Germany in 1923 would be repeated, except not only in one country like Germany then, but in the entire Eurozone, in the entire dollar zone, and from there to spread worldwide. Now, obviously, once people get a sense that hyperinflation is taking away their savings, and in a certain sense, hyperinflation so far has been moving slower by nibbling away the savings, the wages, the buying power. But if you would calculate what has been robbed from the real wages in the last years, you probably could come up with a figure much higher than the 6.75% theft from the little deposits from Cyprus, which were threatened, except it went gradually. And if you have now the effort to paper over this crisis by simply putting more liquidity in the system, this hyperinflation could explode more quickly than it exploded from the spring to the fall in 23. And when people realize that not only gasoline prices, electricity prices, food prices are going up, but that you would have a generalized hyperinflation, you are looking at the danger of a social chaos which makes the present tension look like a picnic. So there is only one solution. One has to recognize that the entire system of globalization is a failed business model. Now, Mr. Schäuble was all the time in the last days very quick to say that the Cyprus model is a failed business model, meaning, the big foreign investors putting money into Cyprus banks for tax reasons. But I can tell you that the system of globalization, as it was imposed after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the whole package, outsourcing, going into cheap labor markets, making, speculation the thing which was awarded, and punishing production. I mean, this whole system of globalization, of profit to the maximum, of money makes money, of neglecting real economy, that business model has failed. And it was clear it would fail because in 1989, when the wall had come down, I was saying in many speeches and articles that if one would make the mistake to impose on the bankrupt communist system the equal bankrupt system of the free market economy, maybe one could keep the process of looting for a couple of years, but then it would come to a collapse whereby the collapse of the communist system would look like peanuts. And now we are exactly at that point. Now there is a solution, and there is especially a historical precedent how we can get out of this. Now the historical precedent I'm talking about is what Franklin D. Roosevelt did in 1933, and the package of measures with which he ended the Depression in 1933. What he did is, first of all, he implemented Glass-Steagall, the separation of the banks. He instituted a Pecora commission to investigate what crimes were committed by the banks in this crisis. Then he basically made the New Deal and thereby issued state credit to everybody who wanted to contribute to produce useful things, including the famous Tennessee Valley Authority infrastructure project. And within a very short period of time, the US economy was booming. And as everybody knows, by the end of the Second World War, the US economy was the strongest economy in the world. Now, that model was replicated by the Kreditanstalt für Wiederaufbau in the period of the reconstruction of the German economy after 1945, which was modeled on Roosevelt's Reconstruction Finance Corporation. And as everybody knows, it led within a couple of years, within a few years, to the German economic miracle admired by the whole world. Now, therefore, there is a solution, but this solution has to start with Glass-Steagall. In the recent period, there was a lot discussion about separation of the banks. Now, I'm proud to say that our organization was probably the most instrumental to not only revive Glass-Steagall in the United States, but also to get that debate going in Europe, because 2-3 years ago, if you would have asked somebody what is a separation of the bank Glass-Steagall, people would know. And in the meantime, you have all kinds of watered-down proposals. Liikanen Commission, the ring-fencing proposal of the Vickers Commission, you have the Volcker Rule. All of these leave loopholes for the continued speculation of the banks, which are as big as barns, barn doors. So these don't function. What we need to do is go back to the original Glass-Steagall as Roosevelt designed it. Now, in a first step, that means that the state has to protect the commercial banks, because these commercial banks are necessary to maintain the economy, to maintain the real economy, pensions, wages, trade, commerce. And then basically the investment banks have to be separated from that And they from now on have to take care of their affairs without bailout packages. If they have problems, sorry, they have to clear their books. If they are bankrupt, well, then they have to declare insolvency. But it must stop that continuously bailouts using state budgets, using taxpayer money, is being misused to enable these banks to continue the high-risk speculation, because this is exactly what has happened after 2008. Today, the situation is worse than before Lehman Brothers, and it's worse because the states have so far done nothing to prevent the high-risk speculation. That must stop. We must declare Glass-Steagall and probably toxic money in the investment banks by the trillions has to just be written off. Now, people are screaming about that because they say, oh, I have these creative financial instruments and this is on my bank and so forth. Well, this is only virtual money. And, you know, if you're losing something virtual, you're really losing nothing. So that will be the first step. Then, however, after all the countries of the United States, and by the way, there is a big motion right now in the United States to implement Glass-Steagall in the Congress, in the Senate, among the state legislators, but also in all European countries, we need to do that. That is only the first step. After we have done that, it will turn out that the amount of liquidity is not sufficient to maintain the economy, because you write off all of this toxic waste. At that point, you need the implementation of a credit system, which means that you have to have national banks in each country who provide credit lines for real production. And these credit lines have to be limited to well-defined projects which have basically a function to contribute to the increase of the productivity of the economy. They have to be in the common good. They have to be organized according to the principle of physical economy. Now, for example, the Kreditanstalt für Wiederaufbau in Germany after 1945 was such a national bank. At that point, it did fulfill such a function. And something like that could be the model for such a bank in every country. The next step is, naturally, you need to go back to the sovereign control of the national currencies. Now, this is relatively easy. For example, at the Hamburg Bundeswehr University, already some years ago, a study was made how one could go from the euro back to the D-Mark, and the professor who did that study came to the conclusion that it is relatively easy because, first of all, we have the experience of the D-Mark to euro transition, and we just would do it in reverse. We could keep the existing euros as a kind of ECU, a European Accounting Union unit for the time being. But then we would start to issue national currencies and have sovereignty about the own currency and the own economy in every country. That means we also need fixed exchange rates to prevent currency speculation. Mr. Soros has no business in continuing to do this. And then we need to adopt a well thought out program to get the real economy going. Now, we have worked on such a program already almost a year ago, and we have produced this study. It's called There is a Life After the Euro, Program for an Economic Miracle in Southern Europe, the Mediterranean and Africa. And you can go to our website and you find all the details about it, but let me explain it shortly. Now, this program basically goes from the assumption that we have right now between the countries of Eurasia a development of the Eurasian land bridge with the potential to become the world land bridge. That is to connect the different continents through infrastructure corridors. For example, it includes the building of the Bering Strait, which is not on this map, combining Alaska and Siberia. It includes vast projects between China and Russia, Korea, Japan. It goes all the way to Chile. And this has been our proposal following the collapse of the Soviet Union. And it's being implemented now in step by step. Now, our program for the development of Southern Europe basically has the idea to connect Europe in a deep way with this world land bridge. Now, a big part of this program is to revive 10 EU transport corridors, which were adopted by a conference of the EU transport ministers at a conference in 1994 in Cyprus, which declared 10 transport corridors to be the priority projects. I think 5 of them go into the Balkans, others into Italy, others into the Iberian Peninsula. And these are plans which are ready. They have not been implemented, almost not at all, because of the austerity policy of the Troika. But these are projects which could start tomorrow. So you could issue credit lines to invest in this railway water system infrastructure project in Southern Europe. We have upgraded this program through other avant-garde projects like building a tunnel, not only building the bridge of Messina between Italy and Sicily, but also a tunnel from Sicily to Tunisia. It includes a tunnel under the Strait of Gibraltar connecting Spain with Africa. This has been done as a feasibility study already 3 or 4 years ago. It has been basically approved and then it was cut. So that could start tomorrow. We want to increase science centers in the Canary Islands, in essence, because you need to have an attraction to stop the brain drain of young people who have fled the unemployment of Spain, Greece, Portugal, and who are now immigrating to Germany or some other countries. You have to attract them to come back, and you have to make a definite plan so that the economic construction of the real economy of the Balkans, of Greece, of southern Italy, of the Iberian Peninsula, of the Mediterranean, and naturally also the Middle East, where we have worked out a whole separate program which is being discussed in many countries right now, and a development plan for Africa. Now, this can be done, and it must be done. I mean, the only way to stop a collapse of civilization in Europe and beyond is to change the course, to recognize that the globalization is a failed business model, that it cannot be maintained, and that we have to put a real program for a future, for a vision, how to get Europe out of this present crisis on the agenda. Now, I think it can be done, but, you know, as I said, as of now, I'm absolutely sure that in Brussels they're discussing the failed business model. And therefore, I'm calling on people in all of the affected countries of Europe to contact us, get more information about this program, and help us to create a growing lobby to implement it.
Thank you very much. You're participating in a live webcast with Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the founder and chairwoman of Germany's Buzo Party and of the International Schiller Institute. We'll now proceed to a period of questions and answers, a discussion period. And let me begin by taking up a more in-depth discussion of some of the strategic implications of the Cyprus crisis. I have a two-part question for you. I heard you say a few days ago, in the middle of the Cyprus crisis, that what this means is that the house of Europe is burning. All of Europe is burning because of this crisis. The amount of money which is being stolen, or they're attempting to steal from Cyprus, is in the range of 6 billion euros. Just for those who are viewing in other parts of the world, and incidentally this international webcast is being simultaneously interpreted into German and into Spanish, as well as the original English. But for international comparisons, given that this is about 1/3 the size of Cyprus's GDP, that would be the equivalent of an instant $1 trillion bailout of the banks in the United States. Now, that's even a little more than Ben Bernanke has done. But it poses the magnitude of the issue here. Now, in one of the comments coming from Cyprus is that of a member of the Democratic Party of Cyprus, Atina Kyriakibou, who said, quote, "They're going to implement this policy in the other countries. So I ask for solidarity from all the other Mediterranean countries, Spain, Italy, because we have to protect ourselves. We have to protect our economy from this catastrophic decision of the Troika and of the ministers of the Eurogroup." So the first part of the question is, what kind of solidarity would actually be effective in reversing these policies? The second part of what I think is the same question is that some of the responses that have been heard in other quarters in Europe to the Cyprus crisis go in what is clearly exactly the wrong direction. For example, someone who is described as a leading Spanish economist, Santiago Niño Becerra, had the audacity of going on national television in Spain to say that what is happening in Cyprus will happen elsewhere, and that we have to accept it because we must save the banks. Why must we save the banks? He said if the Spanish banks go under, the Spanish debt goes under, because they have a lot of debt. Therefore, the banks must be rescued. There is no alternative. Pay. And to make those payments, he had the modest proposal of taking some 5 or 6 million of Spain's unemployed, which is about 27% of the labor force, and throwing them out of the country. So those are ideas which are clearly not going in the right direction. What is the proper form of solidarity? What are the measures to be taken?
Well, as I said, there is a set of policies which would remedy the situation. And short of putting them on the agenda, I don't think that anything will be sufficient. Because, if you have just solidarity as such, it doesn't help. I think what needs to be done is we have to have Glass-Steagall. That is the absolute minimum first step. Because if you don't end the system of speculation, this thing will not function. I mean, you may make some trick. You can maybe postpone it a couple of days or weeks. But the fundamental problem is that the entire financial system of the transatlantic region is so indebted, so loaded with toxic waste, that if you try to save the banks, as this Spanish economist is proposing, you are perpetuating something, and it can only lead to a total catastrophe. There must be an absolute separation of the banks, and that part of the banks which is devoted to the real economy, that must be protected by the state. And that is a measure which must be discussed. And I think the best way of solidarity is to basically, get as many groups, parties, institutions in all the affected countries, which is practically all of them, all of the European countries, and to have that discussion, to agree that we need to have a reconstruction of the real economy, because after all, the banks, the bank money has no intrinsic value. we must go back to a situation where banks are the servers, the people who are serving the real economy. There is no reason why the banks should have this extraordinary status of thinking that they are the crème de la crème of the world, that they have the right to have profits which are ridiculously high. We must go to at least the philosophy of such people like Hermann Abs, who was an industrial banker in the post-war period, who had the ethics of a banker, that the banker must serve the real economy. Or Alfred Herrhausen, the previous head of Deutsche Bank, who was assassinated by a very dubious, maybe not existing third generation of the Red Brigades, the Red Army faction, who had the idea of supporting a debt moratorium for the Third World, who had the idea of using the model of the Kreditanstalt für Wiederaufbau for the development of Poland in '89. I mean, that was the plan he wanted to present shortly before or shortly after he was assassinated. So there are banking models, where banks can be back, normal institutions. There has to be not this mythology that the banks are somehow the Olympus. So I think we need a debate about that. We need to have a banking system whereby, the question is what guarantees the surviving of the real people, the long-term survivability of a country from generation to generation. How can we create productive full employment? How can we eliminate unemployment? The banking system is not a thing as in itself, but the banks must be the servants of the people, the economy, and I think we need to have a discussion about that. And because of the severeness of the crisis, I don't think we have endless time. So therefore, my suggestion is to focus on the model which did function, which is the model of Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1933. And that was replicated, as I said, in the post-war period, in the reconstruction of Germany. And therefore, the package, Glass-Steagall, return to the national currency, go to fixed exchange rates, and then agree on basic infrastructure projects. I mean, in the history of the industrialization of any country and any continent, it was always the investment in basic infrastructure which was the driver, which laid the foundation, which created the environment for other industries to flourish and to bloom. And we need to have a return to a high rate of science and technology to compensate for the losses of industrial capacity in the last years of globalization. So we must get together, we must agree on these principles, and then the best solidarity is to show the people that there is a hope, that people don't have a reason to be despaired, that there is a perspective how we can get out of this crisis. And I think that that discussion, as public and as widely as possible, is the best solidarity we can provide.
Very good. There's strategic aspects of this Cyprus crisis, which I'd like to turn to at this point. In particular, the fairly well-known fact that approximately 1/3 of the deposits in the Cypriot banking sector are Russian. And the Russians were given absolutely no advance warning of this by the EU authorities that imposed this on Cyprus, or are attempting to impose it on Cyprus. In particular, Putin called this a, quote, unfair, unprofessional, and dangerous step. The Financial Times of London, well aware of such strategic implications, quoted Vladimir Yakunin, who they described as the head of the state-owned Russian railways and a close associate of Mr. Putin's, who warned that the proposal could be damaging for Russian-EU relations. And they quote Yakunin saying, everyone knows that 1/3 of the deposits belong to Russian companies and individuals. And he said this was done without even consulting Russia. How could that be? They are solving their problem at our expense. And then finally, at a Moscow Economic Forum, the MEF, held on March 20th and 21st, right in the thick of this crisis, Yakunin again said that this development in Cyprus means the end of neoliberalism. If Europe is going to solve the European Union's problems at the expense of bank deposits and using resources of Russian companies and Russian citizens. And then academician Sergei Glassiev, who is an advisor to President Putin, took the occasion to say that these developments mean that Russia itself must now get behind what he called the de-offshorization. In other words, stopping the process of dependence on offshore funding for Russia itself, which is, of course, a highly polemical and debated issue inside Russia. So can you please discuss with us some of the broader strategic implications of this Cyprus crisis?
Now, one obvious strategic implication is that Cyprus is located in a strategic spot which is, very close to several of the hotspots of the Middle East. It's closer, for example, to Syria than to Europe. It is a contested area. There was a war in '74. Which still, has a lot of tensions between Greece and Turkey. And, the people in Greece are very much affected by this. There are offshore gas reservoirs which are contested between Cyprus and Turkey. So you could easily imagine how a conflict could arise simply because out of this constellation, given the fact that, the whole Middle East is a powder keg ready to blow up even much worse beyond what it is right now. But I think the fact that there is this defiance by the EU of not even finding it necessary to inform Russia as a gesture of, confidence building, it signifies the state of affairs between the EU and Russia, which at this point can only be called extremely volatile and dangerous, and cannot be separated from the whole question of the EU East expansion and the NATO East expansion, which for a long time in the minds and in the eyes of Russia and China, by the way, is being equated. With other words, people in Russia, China, and other countries of Asia, they have looked at the EU East expansion and the NATO East expansion, which developed after the collapse of the Soviet Union, as being the same thing, as being a policy of encirclement which is potentially or is de facto regarded as a security threat, as a national security threat to the existence of both countries, Russia and China. And that is the reason why the recent military ties between Russia and China have been strengthened significantly. From the standpoint of Russia, they regard the deployment of Patriot missiles in Turkey around an incident which is now, according to the military journal of the Austrian army, was an instigated pretext by Turkey itself as a provocation. That deployment of the Patriots as a provocation. And in the same way, the installation of the US missile defense system in Poland, Czechia, Romania, in the Aegis, which they say and have stated openly is designed to eventually, when it reaches its fourth phase, is supposed to take out the second strike nuclear capability of Russia. And Russian military have said very clearly they will not accept that. They are taking countermeasures. So this whole thing is a strategically very, very hot situation. Obviously one cannot separate the financial field, the reason why that the financial system is disintegrating, one cannot separate that from the strategic crisis, which is that we are on the verge of a potential escalation of the Middle East situation, which could potentially lead to a third global nuclear war. So therefore, such seemingly negligence to inform Russia about this is a sign of the times that relations are not good. And in a certain sense, I can only say that the situation is such that it requires an urgent repair. And the urgent repair is to basically declare the business model of globalization a failed experiment, and to go for a real reconstruction of the real economy, and to go for the kind of cooperation between Russia, the United States, and Europe, as it is meaningful. Why should we not do it? I mean, after all, Russia is not communist anymore. Why should we not have an alliance with all countries of Eurasia and not go in the other direction, which can only lead to blowing us all up?
Which was, in fact, precisely one of the central topics at an extraordinary conference held yesterday in the Washington, D.C. area on the 30th anniversary of Ronald Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative speech of March 23, 1983, addressing exactly this issue of how to bring about a complete change in the relationship among the global powers to eliminate forever the danger of the kind of thermonuclear confrontation which we face today. This Schiller Institute-sponsored conference in the Washington, D.C. area was actually the third in a series of such events to pose and discuss internationally the need for an entirely new paradigm, a paradigm shift in all areas, economics, strategic issues, culture, science, and so forth. And it is the third, but it is by no means the last. It is part of a continuing series of such events. And I would like to ask Mrs. LaRouche to comment on and perhaps summarize for us the results of this latest conference and the next steps. Where do we head from here?
Well, that conference indeed was very important. It was, as you said, on the 30th anniversary of the SDI, when President Reagan on the 23rd of March in 1983 had declared the SDI to be the official American policy. Now, most people may not remember, but what was falsely characterized by the international media as Star Wars was actually something quite different. It was based on a proposal by my husband, Mr. LaRouche, who reacted at that time, starting with the end of the 70s, to the middle-range missile crisis which had developed in Europe. Some of you may remember that when the SS-20 and Pershing II deployment meant practically that the launching time for any missile was down to a few minutes, and that you had the two missile systems from the NATO and the Warsaw Pact staring at each other, and the warning time was so short that an accidental thermonuclear war at that time was quite conceivable. And then Mr. LaRouche, my husband, had proposed a system based on on weapons based on new technologies, based on new physical principles, laser beam defense, to basically make nuclear weapons obsolete. Now, that was a proposal which was discussed for 1 full year between Russia, between the Soviet Union at that time, and the United States in sort of back-channel discussions my husband was involved in. And there was a possibility that if both superpowers would have agreed on that, you could have dismantled nuclear weapons forever, and the application of these technologies coming from beam weapons and other systems to be installed in space, the application of this in the civilian sector, which was the offer of Reagan to the Soviets, would have meant an enormous science driver for the civilian economy and would have allowed a gigantic technology transfer to the developing countries, which would have ceased to be puppets in proxy wars between the superpowers. So this was a totally brilliant and genius proposal, which, by the way, was supported at that time by the Bundeswehr, the German military, the Force de Frappe, the French Gaullist military in Italy, even in Argentina and many other countries. And it would have changed the world, because it would have also provided the world the kinds of technologies which are needed to defend the planet from dangers coming from outer space. Now, what was maybe regarded as esoteric possibilities by most people until recently has become a very realistic danger in the minds of many people on the 15th of February, because if you remember, that was the date where both this asteroid came by the Earth at a relative close distance, which was expected, but then at the same day you had a meteorite shower over the Urals, totally unnoticed by any warning system, east or west, and that led to the wounding of 1,200 people in Russia who were affected by that. And that just reminded the world that, you know, these objects are flying around. Many of them are flying with a speed which makes it extremely difficult to do anything about it with the present technologies. And if one of these things would hit, you know, we may be, you know, either having large damage, like in the Tukuska event in 1908 in Russia, in Siberia, or even worse effects. Now, this was not done. Instead, it was rejected. This offer of the SDI was rejected by Andropov at the time. And because of internal opposition in the United States, it got also practically derailed. Now, when this proposal was cancelled, my husband in 1984 said, if the Soviet Union continues to stay with their policies, you know, by going for conventional systems, even including thermonuclear systems, then, you know, they will collapse in 5 years. Now, I know that nobody at that time believed that to be true, but it did happen. The Soviet Union disintegrated between 89 and 91. Now, recently, both because of the threat of a Western ballistic missile system, which is perceived by Russia as a threat to their strategic capabilities, as well as because of these comets, meteorites, and asteroids, there have been many proposals by Russia, among others by Vice President Rogozin, to have a joint defense against both missiles as well as objects from outer space. And what this conference was about was to use the anniversary of the SDIs 30 years ago to basically try to convince people inside the United States to respond positively to these Russian proposals. Now, this, I think, will be a big task because, you know, as also was demonstrated by some of the presentations at the conference, the present policy of the ballistic missile systems is not a continuation of the SDI, but it goes in the direction of what was reported in an article in the Strategic Quarterly Review, the paper of the US Army recently, which admitted quite frankly that the people who are behind this missile system believe that because of technological breakthroughs, it would be possible to take out the nuclear arsenal of an opponent without radioactive fallout. And that basically all of these deployments, Patriots, ballistic missile systems, are actually part of a forward defense of NATO, which is regarded as a strategic threat by Russia and China. So the conference purpose was to try to convince people that we have to replace this policy with the SDE, Strategic Defense of the Earth, where we move away from the idea that you can have conflict resolution by war, because in the time of thermonuclear war, you cannot resolve conflicts anymore with military means if you don't want to blow up civilization. And that we move instead to what one of the other contributors to the SDI, once Dr. Teller, once called the common aims of mankind. Now, we basically had this discussion yesterday, and we are planning to have more such meetings across the United States. And, you know, we are trying to put this on the table with the idea that civilization is in such a tremendous crisis. And either we move in a completely different domain, in a different paradigm of working together on this planet, or we may not make it as a civilization. So the good news is that the participants in the conference were really excited to go in the direction of a new paradigm. So I'm very happy that we did have that conference, and we intend to have many more.
One of the more interesting comments that I heard at the conference yesterday was recalling that immediately prior to the adoption of Mr. LaRouche's Strategic Defense Initiative by President Reagan, before his March 23, 1983 speech, Mr. LaRouche had discussed with his colleagues at the end of 1982, at a time when the Soviet interlocutors in the discussion with Mr. LaRouche had made it clear that they thought there was absolutely no chance that Mr. LaRouche's ideas would actually be adopted in the United States. So at what was perhaps the darkest moment with regard to the possibilities of the SDI, Mr. LaRouche had told his associates at the end of 1982, we must get the SDI adopted within 90 days. And on March 23rd, which I don't have the exact count of numbers of days, but I think it was less than 90 days, the SDI policy was in fact announced by the President of the United States, to the shock and surprise of many people in the world, including the shock and surprise of many people inside the Reagan administration itself, who thought that they had been able to block this completely. Fast forward 30 years to today. In our efforts to get Glass-Steagall implemented, both in the United States and across Europe, along the lines of what Mrs. LaRouche has just outlined, as something which is urgently required to address a strategic crisis and a financial crisis which has the world on fire now, Mr. LaRouche has also made it very clear, as Mrs. LaRouche has just said again today, that this must be done immediately now. There is no time to spare. And yet, if one were to look at the immediate circumstances, one would perhaps say that it seems quite unlikely, if not impossible. So my question to you is, how do we achieve the impossible? What does it take in terms of internal attitude of those of us who are organizing for this, and what does it take to induce or to provoke in the population and the leadership more broadly? How do we bring about the impossible?
Well, I believe in miracles. However, I only believe in miracles which we do ourselves. I think one of the last lines of Schiller's Wilhelm Tell is, "So help us God through our arm," which I think is the right way of going about it. I think we need to activate all the people in the whole world, really. Unfortunately, and this was also a subject of the discussion yesterday, not everybody is even aware of this crisis, neither the Cyprus crisis implication nor the strategic crisis. So that's because of the fact that we are living under an empire, and most people think they are underlings who cannot do anything anyway. But there are about 5% of the people in each country who are thinking, who are following events, who are independent thinkers, who do not adapt to what the mainstream media is prescribing for them to think, but who, have their own independent capacity to make judgments and are not going along with this, entertainment and all of these things which go with it. Now, I think we are now at a point where, given the fact that Mr. LaRouche and the organization internationally associated with him has worked on these things for 40 years. As a matter of fact, Mr. LaRouche made the prognosis in 1971 that this system would come to an end. It took 40 years, admittedly, but he's on the record of having made that prognosis when nobody else did. And since then, we have worked on concrete development plans for Africa, for Latin America, for Eurasia, for the United States, for Europe, for Africa. And as a result of it, and many, many other activities, there is a network of people internationally who agree that what we propose, how the world should go, is a much better alternative and much more in the interest of all of these countries. Now, what we need to do is we have to have a mobilization of activists. We have a tremendous mobilization going on in the United States right now. As a matter of fact, at the conference yesterday, there were several hundred of them. And we have a gigantic mobilization in the state legislators for Glass-Steagall, in the Congress for Glass-Steagall. We are mobilizing constituencies to go to their congressmen, and the same occurs in the Senate. And there is right now a motion towards Glass-Steagall in the United States. There are even articles in the financial press who say, oh my God, one more crisis and they may go for Glass-Steagall. That's exactly true. We are very close to it. And I think we have to just mobilize it and bring it over the edge. I know that there are some bankers who are completely freaked out about this perspective. But, would it be so bad to be a moral banker? Could you not imagine, that you could live to be a moral banker? We are not planning to chop your head off. You're just saying be a servant of the industry again. So we are not really that radical. Anyway, so I think what we need to do is we have to really basically get a movement worldwide of people who agree that we need a new paradigm. I mean, if you look at the crisis of civilization, it is so big. It is the pensions don't function, the healthcare doesn't function, the banks don't function, foreign relations don't function, the culture is full of depravity. The youth is a disaster. I mean, if you have more than 60% youth unemployment in some countries, if you have a youth culture where, 14 years old are doing the most unbelievable things and they know it all, and I don't even want to elaborate what I'm talking about, but most people who are concerned about children know what I mean. I mean, if the youth is becoming the most dangerous spot in the society. In the US, it takes the form of school shootings, of senseless killings. Elsewhere, it takes the form of drug addiction, of robbery because of that. I mean, anyway, I just want to say we are having a civilizational crisis, not a crisis in one area. And we need a new paradigm where civilization is being put on a completely new platform, a new image of man, and a new identity of mankind, what it means to exist on this planet and beyond. What I mean by that is the question of space colonization, of the kinds of projects which we abandoned exactly with the Apollo project and which we have to resume. Now, I think that the paradigm shift is possible. It has been done in the past. For example, the transition from the dark age of the 14th century to the beautiful time of the Italian Renaissance was possible. We have studied how it was done. It can be replicated. You have to activate the high points of cultures of previous periods, steep people in it, and then out of that create something new. Now, we have all the ingredients for that. We know what is necessary, especially a heavy emphasis on classical culture. And, you know, we have an idea how to move civilization into a new era. I think we need to agree on a new paradigm, a paradigm which is more worthy of the dignity and the true identity of man. And to participate in that, I want to invite you, and please contact us, and we will discuss further what to do in the next days and weeks.
Thank you very much, Mrs. LaRouche. So I guess it's clear that the art of forecasting, of looking into the future, is not a question of a spectator sport. It's a question of action. It's a question of creating the future and creating miracles in exactly the way that Mrs. LaRouche was just describing. Miracles are those things which we ourselves bring about with our own right arm. Unless, of course, you're left-handed, in which case you can use your left arm. But we have to do it. You're involved. We need to stay in touch and get to work. Thank you for participating in this emergency international webcast. And any further questions, please send them in through this website and stay in touch. Thank you and good night.